Alrighty. I came across an article today, and it talked about how the three wise men and how their bones are enshrined in the Cologne Cathedral. And it's quite an article, and I thought I'd share a bit of it with you. And it tells the story of the wise men after their apparition and appearing on the at the birth of Jesus, and it continues from there. And it tells the story of how the wise men didn't want to leave each other's company afterwards, so they stayed together. Now, and eventually the apostle Thomas came and visited them, and because they had been so faithful, ordained them bishops. And so they stayed until their deaths. And when they died, the king at the time decided that, well, he should bury them side by side. And then that's how they want to be buried. They want to be buried in a single grave, side by side as each one died. So from the oldest to the youngest, as they died, they were put in the grave and left enough space for the next one, and the next one was put in, and then finally the last one died, and then all three died. And eventually their bones were recovered and made their way through a series of movements and different places, and finally found their way to a cathedral in Cologne. It's quite the story. It's quite the story. And it's become such a story that people flock to this cathedral every day on a pilgrimage to view and touch the the bones of these wise men. So that's what our topic is today. What is folklore? And would be classed and then that as folklore. So just what is folklore? And why is it so important in our storytelling traditions? We really bring folklore into our storytelling traditions. It's something we need, it seems. It's something we want to be there. And so for us, in telling stories, it seems to be incredibly important. Why is that? Perhaps it would help if we worked with a little definition of what we're using for folklore. So folklore is simply the traditional beliefs, customs, and stories of a community passed through the generations by word of mouth. So let me say that again. It's the traditional beliefs and customs and stories of a community passed through the generations by word of mouth. And that's we all do that. We all have these stories. We all have these traditions. We all have this folklore. We have it in the church every day. Well, that's the way we've always done it, or well, the tradition is this, and we say things like that. So we take part of it in this movement every single time we talk. It's an interesting phenomenon. So how does that work itself out in biblical reading? Casper, Melchior, and Balthasar. I like this because one of the readings we're doing today is, of course, about the Magi, the wise men, the three kings, the kings, and so they were named Casper, Melchior, and Balthasar, or so the story goes. So the legend, so the folklore is told that's passed through the generations. And they were called, well, biblically we find in different translations. We find them called wise men, or we find them called magi. Sometimes we even find them called kings. And so it's an interesting thing for us to think about it as we're going through our reading. We're looking at Matthew 2, and we're going to look at 1 through 12. And what I'd like you to think about as we do this is why is the folklore that we add to this reading and take away from these readings, especially at Christmas time with the birth of Christ, the things that we add to it, why are they important? Are they important? But what is it that we do? So I'd like to go through the reading with you, and as I say, it's from Matthew 2, 1 through 12. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. He called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of the religious law and asked, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" "In Bethlehem in Judea," they said, "for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the ruling cities of Judah. For a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd for my people Israel." Then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. Then he told them, "Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child. And when you find him, come back and tell me, so that I can go and worship him too." After the interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them, and it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were filled with joy. And they entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure chest and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. When it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. The message today is called Folklore, Following the Star, the Magi meet Jesus. I don't know whether you noticed as we were reading through that, some of the things that immediately pop out about the Magi, the wise men, the kings. First off, how many are there actually? Tradition has it that there's 3. But what does biblical text tell us? I can hear you all thinking, and and the answer to that is nothing. It doesn't give us a number. There could have been 3. There could have been 10. We don't actually even know for sure that they were men, because the original text doesn't give a gender to who they are. They're simply learned people. There could have been women among them. So we're not told any of this type of stuff. So that's the first interesting thing that we discover, and if we start to think about it, we go, "Oh yeah, okay, well, I'm not sure how many went." And well, if they were important, they probably had an entourage and probably had followings, probably had camels. I'm sure they didn't have all that stuff, the gold and the frankincense and the myrrh strapped to their laps. So they probably had pack animals with them. And it's a long journey, so I'm sure they had tents and provisions. And it would have been quite a show rolling into town, possibly. Once again, this is me and giving conjecture and how I see the story. We look at the story really quite differently, and especially when it comes to the wise men. Let me ask you a question. In your nativity scene, if you have a nativity scene or a nativity scene that you've viewed and looked at, do you notice who they usually put with the wise men, other than the cows and the sheep and the little drummer boy, of course? You know, who else do they generally put with the nativity, with Mary and Joseph and Jesus? Of course, it's the wise men. And yet we find in our story that Jesus had been born and they were searching for him because they saw his star rise. Now, when did that star rise? It could have been the evening he was born. It could have been afterwards that they saw it. We're actually not, once again, told this. But tradition holds many different things. So our story of tradition, our folklore, is that the Magi showed up the night that Jesus was born, and they welcomed him and they bowed before him and they worshiped him, just like the shepherds. And they brought him gifts, amazing gifts. And everything was all happening at once. And yet, if you read the text carefully, you'll notice that they were no longer in the stable. When the Magi or the wise men or the kings found them, they were in a house. And Jesus is no longer referred to as a baby, but now is referred to as a child. So it's been a time. It's been a time. And why do we bring this together? Why is this so important for us to bring this together? What does it give us? What kind of a feeling? And, well, what does it do for you when you bring all of this together? Even though you know parts of the story, like most of you probably knew what I just told you. It probably didn't come as a surprise, and I'm sure you've heard it from other learned people many times that they weren't actually there that evening. But for us, it doesn't seem to matter. We have songs of the wise men, of their trips and their journey. We have songs of how they appeared that evening. We have songs of the nativity scene that we know aren't right. The cows aren't lowing and the cattle are lowing and the baby asleep. Jesus is smiling. We don't have any of that text anywhere. And yet, our traditional stories hold those texts dear to our heart. They're oral traditions that we have shared over and over and over through the generations. So how is it that they become so important, and why is it that they become so precious to us? The interesting thing that we find is folklore. This is a bigger description of folklore, because sometimes we think, well, okay, maybe it's just embellishment, or maybe it's just urban legend. We love that term, urban legend. So maybe it's just these things. So what is it that brings this out? Folklore is further defined as the whole of oral traditions. Now, not just a few, but the whole of oral traditions shared by a particular group of people, a culture, or even a subculture. So smaller communities within communities start to share these oral traditions. And these oral traditions become legend, become folklore, and they become precious to the storytelling of a particular thing. Now, this includes tales, myths, legends, proverbs, poems, jokes, and other oral traditions. It's not limited to a tiny space. It's not limited to a tiny thing. The whole tradition of storytelling is a broad genre. We find it all through the Bible. Storytelling is important, and how the story is told is important. Way before they could write, when people could read, people had to hear the story and had to share the story. And as we all know, and I'm sure we've all done this as kids, we whisper one thing into somebody's ear, they whisper to the next person's ear, they whisper to the next person's ear, and by the time it gets back around, sometimes it doesn't even resemble what first started. It's the idea often, but it's not the words. Each person adds to it, and it becomes what the community talks about. In the Bible we find it. We're reading about the community of Matthew, and Matthew is speaking to his community. is talking about how his community sees the birth narrative, how they see the interaction of Herod with the wise men, how they see the interaction of these magi, of these learned people, of these whoever they were, with Jesus and Mary. How they see the movement of Mary and Joseph and Jesus from a stable into a house where they are living. Joseph probably was at work that day. Things move along. So my question for you today is this, and this is, we've had lots of questions, but the big one really becomes, is the story of the birth of Jesus any less believable if we add our folklore to it? What does it do? What does it change? Or does it change anything? Perhaps it just helps people to understand better. Let's talk about that.